Hi all, and welcome to the Medical AI Lab Talk series. I'm delighted that today we have Arvind Saligrama present Rethinking, Pretraining, and Self-training. Arvind, very excited. Take it away.
Thanks, Pranav. Hey everyone. So as Pranav said, my name's Arvind. Today I'll be presenting Rethinking, Pre-training, and Self-training, which is a paper that came out of Google Brain. And this paper was accepted for publication at the Neurops of 2020. And so it's a pretty interesting paper, and I'm excited to present it to you guys. So first, I'll first go over some background related to the paper. I'll talk about the methods they're going to use along with the data sets they use and their strategies. Then I'll go into their experiments and results. And then I'll give a brief summary of what their main argument was in the whole paper. And then after that, I'll look at some interesting points I found in the appendix. So first, to start, pre-training on vision tasks is definitely a dominant paradigm. Since so many vision tasks are very closely related, it's very possible to learn unique things from one data set and use the parameters you'll learn from that data set and use it towards another vision task. So for example, a lot of tasks are pre-trained on ImageNet classification. Since ImageNet is a large data set with 1.2 million images, it's possible to learn a lot of unique things about the image representations and just a lot of knowledge in general that's useful for other tasks. And so in this specific paper, the authors look at object detection and semantic segmentation. And so we'll experiment with different data sets, but the main method used here is the authors pre-train a model on ImageNet and then see how that performs on object detection and semantic segmentation tasks compared to other methods. Another method that we'll sort of use is self-supervised pre-training. The main method that the authors are trying to argue works well is self-training. But just as a baseline, we experiment with supervised training, such as the ImageNet pre-training. And then another one we experiment with is self-supervised pre-training. And this is essentially a pre-training method that doesn't need human labeled data. And how this works is you can have an image, for example, an image of a dog, and then you create two different augmentations of that image. So what that means is you take the image of the dog and maybe change the color of the dog, or you blur parts of the image, or you stretch it out. And so because of when you're doing this, the image is still a dog. So you know that the labels of the two new images you can create are still going to be the same. And so what self-supervised pre-training does is it tries to maximize the agreement between two images that have the same label. So there are many different types of self-supervised pre-training that you can, self-supervised learning methods that exist. Some can come to mind are SimCLR, momentum contrast, and bootstrap your own latent. But in this paper, the authors mainly make use of the SimCLR method. And like I said, how this works is you take an image, you create some augmentations of it, and you're trying to do contrastive learning with these representations. So you're trying to maximize the agreement of the representation between two images that come from the same image. So for example, if you have an image of a dog, you're trying to maximize the agreement of the representation of the two augmentations you made, while you're trying to minimize the agreement between the dog images and, for example, the cat images. So if you have two augmentations of a cat image, you want the cat images to have maximum agreement and the representation of the dog images to have maximum agreement, but you want to minimize the agreement between the dog images and the cat images. And so overall, the authors try to argue that self-training is much more valuable in a wider variety of settings than self-supervised pre-training and supervised pre-training. So self-training is a pretty unique method, and it uses a teacher model and a student model. So I sort of have an outline of how this works here, and I'm going to go through it right now. So first you have a teacher model, and you have a small amount of labeled, or not necessarily a small amount of labeled training data, but you have labeled training data, and you train a classifier on that labeled training data. And then you have a large unlabeled data set that you can have. And so once you have a classifier that's trained on the labeled training data, you generate pseudo labels for your unlabeled data set. And this is basically just done by considering the outputs of the teacher model and using that as pseudo labels for the unlabeled data set. And there are many ways you can do this. You can either just assume that the pseudo label generated by the teacher model is correct, or you can limit it to pseudo labels that are generated with 90% confidence by the teacher. So then you combine this labeled training data with the pseudo label data and retrain a classifier on this. And then finally, once you've retrained it on this combined data set, you test it on the test set. And so here in our paper, for example, the authors mainly look at object detection and semantic segmentation. So first, they make use of a data set called the COCO data set, which I'll talk more about in coming slides. But you train a classifier first on the COCO object data set. Then you have a large amount of data on ImageNet, and you disregard the labels. Then you try and generate labels for the ImageNet data set using the model you've trained on the COCO data set. And then finally, using this combined ImageNet data with pseudo labels along with the labeled COCO data set, you retrain a new model and then use that to make predictions. So that's sort of how self-training works. And yeah, so the first data set that the authors really study is the COCO data set. And here we're trying to do object detection, which is essentially you're trying to find instances of classes within an image, and you draw a bounding box around it. So for example, here we have a dog and a deer, and there is a bounding box drawn around the dog and a bounding box drawn around the deer. And that's the goal, and that's the ground truth label. Another task that the authors experiment with is semantic segmentation. And for this, they use the PASCAL data set. And the PASCAL data set is slightly smaller in size than the COCO data set as well as the ImageNet data set. But essentially in semantic segmentation, you're not just drawing a box around an instance, you're trying to figure out whether a pixel belongs to an instance of a class or not. So for example, in the bottom image, you have the image on the left and then the ground truth label on the right. And as you can see, there's a train there. And so the pixels that are part of the train are colored green, while the other pixels are colored black. So first, before going to the experiments, the authors sort of talk about some related work and try to use this as a platform to build upon. So first, the authors discuss how unsupervised pre-training has also been gaining popularity due to its success in NLP tasks over the last couple of decades. And it's worked extremely well in NLP because there's an enormous amount of data online for language tasks. But supervised pre-training still has been the most successful. And many studies have shown that convets pre-trained on ImageNet, Instagram, and JFT have had extremely good performance. However, some authors such as Shen et al. In their paper, Object Detection from Scratch with Deep Supervision, and He et al. In their paper, Rethinking ImageNet Pre-Training, has showed that pre-training is not extremely effective. The downstream task is very different from the pre-training task. And furthermore, targeted pre-training, which is actually trying to make your pre-training task similar to your downstream task, that doesn't necessarily improve the performance either. So the authors of this paper try and build upon what Shen et al. And He et al. Have shown, and they actually argue that there are some scenarios where pre-training performs worse than just randomly initializing. And so that's sort of what the main point of this paper is, and we'll get into that soon. So first, the methods. In the paper, the authors experiment with different data sizes for the downstream task. So for example, when we look at object segmentation or object detection, we're going to experiment with 20% of the COCO dataset size, 40% of the COCO dataset size, and so on. And then another variable that the authors experiment with is the data augmentation strength. And so data augmentation is used to input noise while training. And there are many reasons people use data augmentation. One reason could be to generate more data if you have a lack of data. Another could just be to, again, input noise and make sure you're not overfitting. Because in the real world, you won't always be given pristine data, right? So you want to make sure your model is susceptible to all sorts of curveballs that are thrown. And so there are many sorts of methods of data augmentation. The most basic one that the paper considers flip and crop, which, as you can see here, is the image is flipped like in a mirror, and you take the mirror image of the data, and then you can also crop it. So, for example, here we have the image is taken to its mirror image and then resized. So that's the first augmentation method that's experimented with. Then another method called auto augmentation is when the augmentation problem is modeled as a discrete search problem to find the best augmentation policy. So this augmentation method is much stronger than the flip and crop method. And then finally, another one that they experiment with is randaugment, which is you have a series of transformations such as shears, blurring, resizing, and so on. And you randomly select a number of these augmentations to perform in a certain order and then perform them. And so that's the strongest one. And throughout this paper, just for clarity, we give names to the different augmentation strategies. So the weakest augmentation, which is the standard flip and crop, will be augment S1. Then the second weakest one, augment S2, is just auto augment. And then with all of these, scale jittering is employed. And so the standard scale jittering, which means how much you resize the image, that's going to be from the range 0.8 of the size of the image to 1.2 times the size of the image. And that's what's the scale jittering that's employed in flips and crops. But in the second strongest and the strongest augmentation strategies, we employ large scale jittering, which means you take the original image and make it 0.1 times the original size or 2 times the original size or somewhere in between. And so in the second strongest augmentations method, we're using auto augment with flips and crops with large scale jittering. And then the strongest augmentation, which we call augment S4, we're using the random augment strategy that we talked about along with large scale jittering. And so when we're doing supervised pre-training, the EfficientNet B7 architecture is used. And I'm not going to go too much in depth about the architecture because that's not really the focal point of the paper. And then, so there are 3 different methods we use. One is this random initialization, so no pre-training of the model's weights. Then there's ImageNet initialization, which is a model which is initialized with the checkpoint where there's notice an 84.5% accuracy on the top one ImageNet dataset. And then another initialization method is ImageNet++, where we're taking a pre-trained checkpoint where there's 86.9% accuracy on the top one dataset. Okay, so then again, let's go into the self-training method for this specific dataset. So we'll first, again, train a teacher model on the labeled COCO dataset. And then we'll generate pseudo labels for an unlabeled ImageNet dataset. So we're taking an ImageNet dataset, discarding the labels, and then we're generating pseudo labels. And so now this student model is trained on the joint human labeled and pseudo labeled dataset. And so originally the authors use a loss function, which is loss function equals human loss plus alpha times the pseudo loss. But they found that this was unstable during the experience. So they use a loss normalization method, which is shown right here. And the human loss bar, which is the numerator of that fraction right there, that's the moving average of the human loss. And they found that this normalized lost work worked a lot better than the previous loss, which was found to be unstable. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about the object detection experience and talk about what their actual findings were. So again, we were using the COCO dataset for object detection, and we're using a RetinaNet detector with the EfficientNet V7 backbone. And then we're also using feature pyramid networks. And again, I'm not going to go too in-depth into these architecture elements because that's not really the focus of the paper. Then we're using training batch size of 256 with weight decay of 1 e to the -4th. Then we're training the model with a learning rate of 0.32 and a cosine learning rate decay schedule. And so now here's some data that compares different augmentation strategies and then also looks at different fractions of the COCO data set that we're using. So first, in the weakest augmentation policy, which is augment S1, the results we get is what we expect to happen. The randomly initialized weights perform the worst, and then the two ImageNet pre-trained models perform better. And this is using the average precision metric. However, once we increase the strength of the augmentation policy, we get some weird results. It actually turns out that even with the second weakest augmentation policy, the randomly initialized weights are actually doing better than the pre-trained weights. So this suggests that as we increase the augmentation policy, supervised pre-training has very diminishing results, as just randomly initializing the weights seems to do better. And then on the other hand, as we vary the COCO data set, we also get vary the size of the data set we're using for the downstream task, we also get some weird results. Again, when we're using only 0.2 of the data, the COCO data set data for the downstream task, the randomly initialized weights perform the worst, which is what we would expect. However, as we increase the fraction of the COCO data set used, the randomly initialized weights slowly start to perform better than the ImageNet pre-trained weights, which is, again, slightly weird, but that's the main finding of this paper, that pre-training, in paradigms where the augmentation strength is extremely strong, along with paradigms where there's not too much data for the downstream task, supervised pre-training, or there's a lot of data for the downstream task, supervised pre-training isn't super effective. And so here's just basically the previous data, but in a tabular format. So as we can see here, we have the different augmentation strengths, and the randomly initialized weights do perform better than ImageNet on augmentation S2, augmentation S3, and augmentation S4 methods. However, when we use self-training, it still performs better than the randomly initialized method for all the augmentation methods. So this indicates that unlike pre-training, self-training is powerful no matter what the circumstances for the augmentation strength or the data set size. And so here again we're gonna vary the amount of data we have for the downstream task. And so when we have 20% of the COCO data set, randomly initializing the weights performs worse than self-supervised pre-training with ImageNet, which is again what we showed previously. However, as we increase the data set size, the randomly initialized weights perform better than the ImageNet pre-trained weights. However, self-training actually performs better as we increase the data set size no matter what. So that was supervised pre-training, but how does self-supervised pre-training fare? So again, here the authors pre-trained with the SimCLR framework, and instead of using the EfficientNet backbone, the authors used the ResNet 50 backbone. And again, here, the SimCLR method performs worse than the randomly initialized method, and it performs the same as the supervised method. And both of these methods actually underperform the randomly initialized method. And here we're using the augmentation S4 method. So this sort of indicates that even when we have strong augmentation methods, using self-supervised pre-training also isn't as effective. So that through those experiences, we're kind of showing that self-training is more robust and can be more effective in a larger number of scenarios. So now the authors try and see how well they can make their models perform. And so now we're going to use a SpineNet backbone for the COCO dataset. And the reason we're changing the backbone here is just because SpineNet was closer to the state of the art. And instead of using the ImageNet as our dataset as our unlabeled data source, we're using the Open Images dataset, and we're using the Augment S3 method. And we experiment with two different SpineNet backbones. And the two current strongest methods, as we saw, had a 51.0 AP on the test dataset and a 52.8 AP on the dataset. But when we implemented self-training, our SpineNet models were actually able to beat the previous strongest SpineNet models that use supervised pre-training. All right, so that was object detection. Now the authors looked at semantic segmentation, specifically using the PASCAL dataset. And here are the experimental settings. We're going to use the Augment S4 method. We're using cosine learning rate decay. We're using a learning rate of 0.08, and then we'll be using EfficientNet B7 and EfficientNet L2 backbones. So we see that the EfficientNet B7 and the EfficientNet L2 are only pre-trained with ImageNet++, and we aren't really considering the weaker ImageNet pre-training or randomly initialized, because as PASCAL is a smaller data set, it still will benefit from pre-training. So, because remember, as we talked about before, only as we increase the data size does supervised pre-training start to show diminishing results. And as we can see here, the previous state of the art was 89.0 on the PASCAL segmentation data set. And so when we implemented our efficient L2 model with self-training and pre-trained ImageNet, supervised pre-training on the ImageNet data set, we were actually able to beat the state of the art with the 90.5 MIOU. And the MIU is basically just the mean intersection over union. So we're seeing how accurate our segmentation was. Okay, so we've shown how self-training has performed better than supervised pre-training and self-supervised pre-training in a variety of scenarios. But how do these perform when we add them all together? So one method that the authors experimented with was joint training. And until now, we've trained the ImageNet dataset only with the pseudo labels or the human labels, but we haven't done both at the same time. So one thing the authors try and do is train the model on both the classification data along with the pseudo labels. So we first take away the labels for the ImageNet data, then we make pseudo labels from our teacher model for the ImageNet data, but we also keep in mind the classification labels. So as we're training, we consider both the classification task along with the object detection task. And so this is the data we have here. When you randomly initialize the model, supervised pre-training beats, supervised pre-training beats randomly initialized methods. And then when you implement self-training, our performance increases. And then when you implement joint training, our performance increases as well. But when you implement both of these self-training along with joint training, our performance continues to increase. So that indicates that all of these methods are additive and that they won't hinder each other when you try many of these methods at the same time. All right, so in summary, stronger data augmentation and more labeled data further diminish the value of pre-training. However, when we're using self-training, we don't have to worry about these circumstances. Self-training has been shown to increase performance in all of these scenarios. And when pre-training is helpful, so for example, in the image segmentation data set, since the PASCAL data set that we used was so small, pre-training was helpful there. But even when pre-training is helpful, self-training can improve upon that, which indicates that all of these strategies are added. Okay, so that was the meat of the paper. Now I'll go over some parts of the appendix which I thought were useful. And throughout the study, whenever we had a student model, so for example, the student model that would learn the combined pseudo-labeled data set along with the human labeled data set, we were initializing the weights of the student model with the weights of the teacher model. But however, here, the authors experiment with randomly initializing the student model. And I just thought it was interesting because this sort of shows a similar trend that we saw when we were testing randomly initialized data versus supervised pre-trained data, supervised weights. Remember when we randomly initialized the weights of a model, it performed worse than weights initialized from ImageNet dataset tests when we had Augment S1 method. But as we increased the strength of the augmentation method, the randomly initialized weights did better. But here, as we randomly initialize the weights, it actually performs better for the augmentation S1 method, but it shows an opposite trend where the teacher initialized weights do better for stronger augmentation methods. And then here, whenever we were varying the fraction of the COCO data set, we used the Augment S4 method, but this is just the data for other augmentation schemes. And I thought it was kind of interesting to see. Again, when we use the Augment S1 method, the randomly initialized weights always performed worse no matter what fraction of the COCO data set we used. But as we increased the strength of the augmentation method, the randomly initialized weights start to perform better and better as we increase the fraction of the COCO data set. So yeah, I think that's it for my presentation. Thank you all for tuning in, and you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Arvind. That was a fantastic presentation.